Every day, millions of units of FDA-regulated commodities flow into the consumer market, from prescription pills and medical devices to packaged food and tobacco. When a critical defect is discovered in that supply chain, people assume the FDA simply slams a button and unilaterally orders the product off the shelves. That is a misconception. The reality of how the FDA handles these market removals is governed by a rigid blueprint, Chapter 7 of the Regulatory Procedures Manual. A recall is not a single universal legal action. It is a broad administrative umbrella covering several distinct legal mechanisms. To survive a market removal, regulatory professionals must navigate two frameworks simultaneously: the FDA's centralized data architecture and the specific statutory matrix that dictates the agency's legal leverage over different products. Treating all recalls as identical events leads to compliance failures. A firm's legal and financial exposure depends entirely on which specific pathway initiates the removal. The first framework is the Recall Enterprise System, or RES. RES is a centralized logistical digital backbone that standardizes the workflow, regardless of how a recall starts. The timeline begins with initiation, defined as the recalling firm's first communication to its accounts or the public. Upon learning of this, the FDA Division Recall Coordinator has exactly 1 working day to submit a recall alert into RES. This alert notifies the Center Recall Unit, or CRU, of the correction, the reason, and the anticipated classification. This triggers a second deadline. The division has 5 working days after receiving the firm's data to submit a formal recall recommendation, or RR. The RR functions as the formal trigger for the Center Recall Unit to review the firm's recall strategy. The CRUs uses this data to conduct a health hazard evaluation, or HHE, assessing the actual physical risk presented by the defective product. The results of the HHE dictate the final regulatory classification assigned to the event: Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3. There are operational exceptions. Standard market withdrawals, removals for minor violations or stock rotations, are not normally entered into RES unless specifically directed. Removals involving products strictly labeled for export with absolutely no U.S. distribution may also entirely bypass the standard RES documentation process. RES is designed to force the chaos of a sudden market defect into a highly predictable, standardized bureaucratic pipeline. While RES tracks the data, the legal reality of the recall depends entirely on who triggers it. The default expectation is a firm-initiated recall under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 7.46. This pathway accounts for the vast majority of market removals. During a voluntary recall, the FDA does not dictate the initial terms. They review the strategy, advise on communications, and audit the firm's actions. The agency expects firms to follow rigid communication guidelines, such as conspicuously marking envelopes and letters with the word urgent for Class 1 and Class 2 hazards. There is a gray area. The FDA can informally recommend that a firm cease distribution and recall the product without formally invoking their legal authority. If a firm refuses, we reach the next rung on the escalation ladder, the FDA requested recall under Section 7.45. This mechanism is reserved for urgent situations where mandatory authority does not exist. Executing an FDA-requested recall requires clearing massive internal bureaucratic hurdles. It demands formal approval and a multi-step workflow involving the CRU, the Office of Strategic Planning, the Office of Chief Counsel, and finally the Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs. The agency maintains powerful hidden leverage here. Before formally requesting a recall via the Associate Commissioner, the FDA holds strong cards. They ensure they already possess the concrete evidence required to pursue a formal seizure or injunction if the firm ultimately refuses to act. The FDA's escalation ladder is engineered to strongly incentivize firm-initiated voluntary action by keeping the burdensome formal requests and legal actions operating in the shadows. The final, most severe escalation pathway is the FDA-mandated recall. As this authority matrix illustrates, the FDA's power to outright mandate a recall is heavily siloed. They cannot force a recall on every product type. For foods, the threshold falls under Section 423. It triggers only when there is a reasonable probability of 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗪𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂. serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. Medical devices operate under Section 518E, requiring a similar threshold of serious consequences, but under different regulations. Tobacco products fall under Section 908C, which mandates proof of a specific manufacturing defect not ordinarily found in products on the market. The tobacco statute contains a unique procedural quirk. The mandate order must provide the firm with an opportunity for an informal hearing within 10 days. Other specific statutes cover controlled substances, biological products, and infant formula, each carrying distinct regulatory thresholds. The ultimate judicial override comes in the form of recalls ordered by consent decree. In these scenarios, the exact actions and timelines are prescribed by a court order, superseding the procedures manual entirely. A firm's legal leverage is not based on general FDA policy. It is dictated entirely by where their specific product sits on this statutory matrix. All these internal legal machinations and matrix authorities eventually converge into a public-facing resolution. That resolution is the FDA enforcement report. This is where firm-initiated, requested, and mandated actions are all standardized and published weekly. The absolute condition for a recall appearing on this report is that the action must be processed through RES and formally classified by the FDA. Unclassified actions can still be listed publicly as not yet classified records if the agency determines the removal meets the baseline definition of a recall. The FDA utilizes strict RES tracking and the looming threat of the authority matrix to ensure that even voluntary recalls achieve a standardized, publicly documented market correction. For regulatory professionals, your interaction with a division recall coordinator must be meticulously tailored to your commodity's specific statutory exposure. Mastering the nuances of Chapter 7 is the only way to transform a chaotic, high-stakes market defect into a legally managed, predictable regulatory outcome.